argument. I mean, a lot of what we've been giving is sort of moral arguments, but this is the sort of put more specifically as the moral argument for God's existence. And the argument is often put this way. If God does not exist, notice the negation, then objective morality does not exist. Objective morality does exist, just taking the double negative out of there. Therefore, taking the double negative out, God exists. So here it's in a way sort of keying in on specifically moral values, you might say it that way. There's other sorts of values that we could talk about, or the value of the human person and so on. But here we're talking about moral value and morality, moral facts, if you will. What is a moral fact? Well, I usually illustrate it this way, is to say there's a lot of claims we make where the claim is a sort of is statement. So if I say, or what we might call a descriptive statement, where I say something is the case, I might describe how many people died in the Holocaust, let's say. But notice, if I just were to say 6 million, and it's probably something more like 12 million, by the way, but people say 6 million often, 6 million Jews died in the Holocaust. Notice, you don't know if I'm a fan of that or not by just what I say, because all I did is describe it. But I could be a Nazi saying, hooray, 6 million people died, 6 million Jews died in the Holocaust or something. Right? It's not until we sort of have a value judgment added into that, or a what we call a normative term added into that. The distinction is between descriptive versus normative. Descriptive would be something like 6 million Jews died in the Holocaust. Holocaust, how do we spell that? I always forget, it's weird. H-O-L? Like that? Something like that? Something like that? H? Let's just say that. 6 million Jews died in the Holocaust. Now, if I were to say, it's bad that, right, 6 million Jews died in the Holocaust, or it's good that 6 million Jews died in the Holocaust, or I were to say 6 million Jews shouldn't have died in the Holocaust, or that Hitler ought not to have done what he did. Notice those are all normative claims. If I can write that one, I think. Hitler ought not to have killed 6 million Jews, or whatever. I've got what we call a normative term here. Ought not. Now, why do we call it normative? Well, think of the fact that there's a kind of norm involved in a normative claim. So it's always got some standard or norm that you're sort of have in mind in uttering the claim. Right? Why does it make sense to say Hitler ought not to have done what he did? Because he violates some sort of moral standard that we have in mind. Now, you can have morally normative claims and non-morally normative claims. So if I were to say, actually, let me say it before I say that. What you want to look for are terms like this: ought, ought not, should not, good or bad, or evil. These are all normative terms, and they signal for us that we have a normative claim being made. Bestest, right, or whatever, right? These are all normative claims. So if you were to say Michael Jordan's the best basketball player that's ever lived, you've got some standard in mind, it seems. That's a normative claim. Now, it's not a morally normative claim, right? There's no moral standard that you're weighing that against. That would be just some sort of, value judgment about what statistics count the most weight and so on and so forth. And people debate this. People will say, no, LeBron James is the best, or whoever in history is the best. Right? They will be arguing about which values or which norm, in effect, to go by, or which person best sort of accords with that norm or ideal or whatever. Okay. Now, these are odd, if you think about it. It's odd that we make such claims, because here we're not claiming what the world is like. We're claiming what the world ought to be like, or ought not to be like, as the case may be. Now, it's somewhat easy to figure out what would make our descriptive, what I'm calling descriptive claims true. Right? Remember this little drawing we had when we talked about truth a few times here, where we're believing that there's a tree in front of us, and that's made true by the fact that there's a tree in front of us. Think of this as a descriptive claim, and I might just take the picture out of it and give it a claim. There's a tree. Right? And that's made true. There's a correspondence here between my claim and the fact that makes my claim true. Right? This is what we call the truth maker. This is the truth bearer. And this is the truth relation. Now, think about the difficulty when I say something like, murder is wrong. What makes that true? We all think that's true. Atheist, Christian, theist alike thinks murder is wrong. Right? Unjustified killing or something like that is wrong. But to what does that correspond? What fact can we put out here that makes this the case that murder is wrong?
Define what murder is.
Perhaps that's kind of what, I was just trying to give a quick characterization. Yeah. That's why I say, so think of it as unjustified killing for no good reason, whereas execution will always have, it could be an unjustified execution, which we might call murder. But think of it as what we're claiming, or something like this. Again, there's always going to be these sort of definitional questions, it seems.
Last hour, Hitler didn't break any laws.
Yeah. No, he wasn't illegal, but he certainly broke the moral law. And that's part of what we're saying here, is if we're just talking about the legal things, that's we can do that. That's what happens. It's not always neat and easy and whatever, because we have lawyers in the world. Right? They mess it up. No, I'm kidding. Right? But that's something that can be debated, and we've got judges to sort of adjudicate between whether or not somebody has violated the law. And sometimes they've done something morally wrong, though they haven't violated a law, and they go free. And that happens actually quite regularly. If we were to claim torturing children for fun is wrong, right? This is our claim we're making. And everybody is going to say amen to that, right? That's wrong. It's wrong to torture children for fun. It's probably wrong to torture children for any reason, but let's just make it clear, say this is a clear moral truth. Okay, what does that correspond to? That makes it true. What fact of the world, let me say it this way, what fact in your worldview makes this claim true? And that's where I think the atheist struggles, to point out a fact. Whereas I think, now this is not going to be a very well worked out view, the way I'm going to put it just now, but we can work it out in much greater detail. but I think ultimately this corresponds to God. Add just another layer of detail for our purposes right now is to say that that violates the moral character of God. It's the moral character of God that provides for us a kind of moral code, ultimately, from which he expresses his commands and out of which he expresses his commands and such. Right? That makes it the case that that's morally wrong to torture children for fun. And that's the moral argument in a nutshell. Because what we're saying is, if you don't have God, then there doesn't seem to be any facts out here that would make these claims true. But of course this is true. So there must be, if the only contender to sort of fit into this hole, so to speak, is God, and you think this is true on the basis of some fact or other, and God's the only fact that can do the deal, then God must exist.
What if the rebuttal is that society does?
The society does what?
From an evolutionary viewpoint,
Yeah.
we choose to live within certain parameters because it helps to ensure our survival as a species continuing on. Therefore, we have agreed upon a certain number of rules.
Yeah. So a person will go one of two different ways with that, it seems to me. One is the kind of Michael Ruse approach to say, so therefore this isn't true. He would say that this is, strictly speaking, false. That there's some sort of objective violation of some moral code. He didn't think that's right. He thinks the only reason why we act and have a sort of sense of moral rightness or wrongness or good or bad is because evolution has programmed us that way because it helps us survive better as a species. So that's one way. And that's where I say it gets problematic, right? Because that is to concede a lot of these things. It's just to say, so therefore, you really couldn't have a problem with Hitler. You really couldn't have a problem with Stalin. You couldn't have a problem with Jeffrey Dahmer, the rapist, et cetera, except for that it's not going well for our species. But if Hitler can make the argument that, well, actually this is better for our species, you're going to have a tough time, I think, rebutting that argument. And so a lot of people say is, look, to deny, even if they make a kind of argument like that and it sounds somewhat plausible, it ends up with so many implausibilities that we should reject whatever led us there. Right? We know this is wrong more than we know that evolution has occurred. I think we have a clearer view of this, which, by the way, I think is what Romans 2 is talking about with God's written the law, moral law in our hearts and so on. I think we have a clear view of moral facts, and that would be, for me, part of the sort of awareness or acquaintance with God that we all have. We know what's morally right or wrong. If moral rightness or wrongness is grounded in the character and person of God, then we thereby have an awareness of God, even if we deny his existence, even if we sort of suppress his existence in claim, being atheist or whatever. But I think we have. So the other route that somebody could go with that is to say, and that does provide some sort of objective morality or whatever. But it's just hard to see how that could be right, because we could have developed differently. We could have developed such, evolutionarily, such that rape was really good for our species, or torturing children for fun is really good for our species. And again, nobody thinks, even if that were to be the case, I think a lot of people would say, even if that was sort of like hardwired into us, like I think you were talking about the tribalism or whatever. Even if those things are sort of hardwired into us, they're still wrong, and we should overcome them. And Michael Ruse is really interesting in this way, because that's where I say I always want to ask him, what do you tell your child when your child does something that didn't hurt anybody? Does something wrong, cheats on an exam or something like that. What do you say if your view is that there really are no moral facts? I mean, what does he tell his kid? You need to just act this way, because I said so, or there's some sort of benefit to me, studying that you can't see it, kid. Sorry, but you should. If there are no moral facts, then it seems like his kid should cheat if he could get away with it. Robert, do you have something? Yeah.
So if there is no God and there are no morals, why should then I care about my species?
Yeah. And that is a difficulty, I think, because the way Darwin at least envisioned it, right? Nature is brutal, and it's selfish and cruel, right? It's in a way acting, quote unquote, we got to do this, or, from the evolutionary perspective, immorally all the time. And so how does it sort of switch when we get to humans, that all of a sudden we need to act in this altruistic way where we're sort of acting for the good of our species, or the good of, I'm going to sacrifice my life? No, I mean, if this is true, do I have my mic on, by the way? I just thought it. Yeah. I turned it off for the break. If I am, if Darwinism is true, then it's survival of the fittest. Right? I should be knocking people out of my way, kids or otherwise, if that's true. And again, that's why I say with Michael Ruse, I don't know why, I don't know at the end of the day why he lives a moral life if he thinks these are ultimately illusions. Question?
I was, would they be able to argue, like, sympathy? Like, I don't feel remorse if I blow up an anthill, but torturing children or a Holocaust, like I used to be a child, or I am. Are you saying that, if sympathy exists, God's the only solution?
Well, see, there again, it would be to say, yeah, it could be that somebody doesn't torture a child because of sympathy or some sort of emotions, but that seems to be sort of shaky moral grounds, because so what if you can, I mean, we can get used to things, right? Doctors have to get used to, they actually struggle through the fact that they're hurting somebody, when they sort of cut them open or whatever. There's a lot of like emotions that kind of come with it, and part of their training is to sort of get used to it and get beyond the emotions of it all, because they really are truly helping that person. So if sympathy is all that we've got, it just doesn't seem like those are going to be moral grounds. And then you ask somebody, well, what if I don't feel sympathy for them? Can I then torture the kid? And almost everybody's going to say, no, you shouldn't, right? You shouldn't. And that's going to be a normative claim that I think makes best sense on a theistic picture and doesn't make much sense on an atheistic picture. Because, again, what the atheist has to do is come up with some objective standard, it seems. And it's not going to be enough to just say, well, our society sort of thrives better when we do this. Because Nazi society thrived pretty well. I mean, right? I mean, they were able to, in some ways, thrive better. They were able to take out the weakest among them, the sort of burdens, what they viewed as the burdens on society and things like that. Only problem is they had to act in these horrific ways to do it. And almost everybody agrees with that. But that, again, it just leads to the question then, well, what makes that the case? What's your moral ground for saying that? And I'm not saying, though it probably sounds like I'm saying, that the only way in which you can have morals is if God exists. I'm not actually saying that. I'm saying what makes best sense is if there's a God. Somebody could, remember the three options that I said there are with all of these things? You either say it's an illusion, You deny that this is even true, which again, I don't recommend that, nor do I recommend hanging out with people that think that. Because if they really think it's okay to do immoral things, okay, look out for them. But they could also claim that they just are. They could say, look, the reality is just such that it's wrong to torture children for fun. And you say, well, why is it wrong? There's no answer to that. It just is. Now, is that very satisfying? No. It's almost by definition not satisfying. It's what we call being ad hoc. It's just positing what you need in order to make the system go. But that would get morality on view, in the view. There's a recent debate, probably the most recent debate that William Lane Craig did, the author of our textbook, was against a guy named Eric Weilenberg. And Eric Weilenberg argues that he's an atheist, but he says that there are objective moral values. They just are. That's just his view. So that's I haven't watched it yet, but I've heard it's a pretty great exchange on these issues. So what I'm saying, remember how I said it, it's the best explanation for this fact. Sorry, for this fact that this claim is true is that there's a God. I don't find it plausible in the slightest to say, well, we just lucked out. We just happen to be the case. It just is the case that torturing children for fun is morally wrong.
Professor?
Yes.
Yeah. I was going to say that there was moral before Christ.
Yes, absolutely.
Culture, but what is the problem to me is when you do the wrong thing because of I mean,
yeah. When you do the wrong thing because you think God has commanded you or something like that, is that what you mean? So like the, yeah. Now that's right. That's right. So that's the point that we're emphasizing here is whether or not this claim could be true. Now this could be the case. It's possible that there's just some fact that exists out there beyond time and space, I guess, such that it's wrong to torture children for fun. Right, that's possible. Now, okay, there's lots that you said there, so I'm kind of struggling to dive in here. So one thing to say is, yeah, we're not saying you've got to go to the Bible. You've got to go to the New Testament in particular, or teachings of Jesus, in order to know that this is wrong. I think all of us who are moral agents that are cognitively developed enough and reflect on it in the slightest will see that this claim is true. That torturing children for fun is wrong. Now, how do we know that? Again, that's where the story that I don't actually think we go to Scripture for that. Now, Scripture is certainly consistent with it, and we might, if we're seriously considering whether or not torturing children for fun, right? I don't know that any of us really do. I think we just know that on the basis of our awareness of God's character, our awareness of God. That's the sense in which we just have this intuitive grasp on morality. And I think we all do. I think all cognitively developed adults do. So it's definitely not the case that we have to be living in an age, after Jesus and looking at the New Testament and so on. Now, what did the Greeks, what did, say, like Plato, Aristotle, say is the fact that makes this true? Well, they were all theists, remember. None of them were atheists, the sort of main Greek philosophers. Plato would say something like, there's a form that exists outside of heaven and outside of space and time that is the good. And that somehow makes this true. It's just not a very plausible view, especially in an atheistic framework. Because again, Plato didn't think that either. He was a theist. So he had God, but he also had something like the good that made for objective morality. So the Greeks did, I mean, it's not, that's why I say, it's not to say you can't plug some things in here. It's just to say, I don't find any of them to be very satisfying because it looks like you're just plugging something in here that matches this. Whereas I want to say, I think that what's far more plausible, that better explains this reality, the sort of moral world that we as humans live in, that don't seem to be obligations that animals have. Animals don't have moral obligations. Why? Well, because this is a world that's created by God with a moral framework. And those that are moral agents are aware of what we ought and ought not to do. We're aware of these moral facts that are ultimately, for me, facts about God. Now, not every Christian philosopher would say that those are facts about God. That's probably the dominant view or a very, very common view. But not everybody would say that. But somewhere God's got to figure into this picture in order to best explain, it seems to me, this kind of fact. I don't know if I'm getting at what you asked. But yeah, so there's the moral epistemology, the moral knowledge. And I think we all have that, no matter if you're Greek or in a desert island or American or whatever. We have an awareness, intuitive awareness of the sort of a wrongness of torturing children. Now, I give a theistic picture for that. I give a kind of theology to that. And I think that's an awareness of God and his moral character. That's the moral knowledge issue. But whether or not somebody could plug something in here, I think, yeah, I just don't find them very plausible. Right? I don't find the atheistic options to be very satisfying. You know, in other words, Weilenberg is probably one of the better attempts at it, and you know, it just seems like he's helping himself to morality. Now, somebody could say, look, if you posit God here, that's ad hoc too, but it's not, because we've got independent reasons for thinking that God exists. We've already given the argument from absurdity, the moral argument. We'll give a variety of cosmological arguments. We'll give some teleological arguments, fine-tuning and design and so forth. We can give arguments from consciousness and so on. We can give the ontological argument. Right? All of these are independent lines of reasoning to think that God exists. So it's not ad hoc to posit God as the best explanation for this when we've got other reasons for thinking so. Does that make sense? So whereas it seems to me somebody like Weilenberg is saying there just are these facts, right? All that does is solve the moral argument. It's literally ad hoc. It's just to serve the purpose of solving this issue. Sort of plug the problem. Okay, we talked about that. We didn't get very far here. Let's see. That's the idea of normative. The oughtness implies a standard. And on my view, this isn't everybody's view, but my view that given these values, we have certain obligations. And it's especially, and a lot of people will say this, that it's especially hard to understand why we have any obligations if there's no God. Right. In other words, why think you literally ought to do something if, I mean, here's one way. I don't think this is exactly the right way to put it as a Christian should, but it's if we were to think of it this way, that God will punish us if we don't do certain things, where there's certain punishment involved. Well, there you go. You've generated at least some sort of obligation to do that action. But if there is no God, there is no eternity, there is no afterlife, there is no punishment, and the end result for a Stalin or Mother Teresa or somebody is the exact same, namely death and, ceasing to exist in every sense, it's hard to see how there's any obligation to live as Mother Teresa did rather than Stalin. So obligations you're going to think of as duties and so forth. My own view is to say that we only ever have obligations to people. Right? It's only when we stand in certain relationships to people that we thereby have obligations. So I have certain obligations to my wife in virtue of the fact that I stand in a certain relation to her, namely, being married. So and to my kids, I have obligations to them, and they have obligations to me. Give them one thing. No, I'm kidding. Right? In virtue of our relationship. But what does it mean to have an obligation to an inanimate object? What does it mean to have an obligation to the tree or something like that? It's hard to see what the obligation would be. We typically have obligations to people. And again, if that's right, then we can make sense of a obligation on a theistic picture and not so well on an atheistic picture. So running through each of these premises, again, this is a deductively valid argument, so one of the premises has to go if we're going to deny the conclusion. We'll have to deny one of the premises. With premise 1, I want to say, what's the alternative? I don't think we can get it done with evolution, because again, I don't think it generates genuine morality. It might describe why we act in certain ways, in the same way evolution might describe why a mother, dog or something protects its young. But I don't think that gives us morality again. I might instinctually protect my kids, but there seems to be something different when I'm wrestling with, some decision or other, and I consider my obligations to them, and I make the decision in part because I have certain obligations to them as their father. That seems to be just on a whole different category than the sort of instinctual behavior that, say, a dog or lion or something has. Can we ground it in human nature? It seems to get it backwards. It seems to say, when we talk about, there are some moral theories that try to say whatever causes the sort of flourishing of humans and in light of human nature and so on, then that's what we morally ought to do. But again, I'm not sure how that generates oughtness, and it seems to get it backwards. Seems we ought to do certain things, flourishing kinds of things because of these moral facts to start with. And just so theories like Weilenberg's aren't going to get it done either. I think I've already made this point pretty clearly, but just in case not. We're not saying an atheist can't know what right and wrong is. We're not saying that an atheist can't do right in principle, putting certain theological considerations to the side. The question is whether the atheist can explain the ground of right and wrong. Come up with something that can function here as making this moral claim true. Premise 2, not too many people are going to deny premise 2. At least not with their lives. Premise 2, again, is that objective morality does exist. Now, somebody like Ruse does, and there are others, but again, they typically live life as if there's objective morality. So again, they seem to act more like the pacifist that beats you up. They don't tend to act very consistently with that. Now, I think we can illustrate this idea of ground by these two statements. That's going to sound pretty good to you. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They're endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in spirit of brotherhood. Gender neutral, but hey, we'll let that go, right? This is the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Contrast that with this one. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Notice you get a ground for morality in one and not the other. So the UN Declaration doesn't have a ground, whereas the US Declaration does. Which I think is really interesting. I mean, try to think of this. What would be an unalienable right if there is no God? If you are not fundamentally different from, say, a mosquito or the dog or the dolphin or something, which that's meant to be more highly developed with the nervous system and so on, being. And again, some people might say, well, you're not, right? But most people live as if we are, right? If there's a human life involved, it's a game changer for whatever situation is. If it's a dolphin life, there might still be efforts and so on to save if it's some sort of situation like that. But we don't think of dolphins as having inalienable rights, it seems to me. How could you possibly ground unalienable rights without a creator? We could all agree we're going to give you rights, but if that's all it is, it's just based on the agreement, then we can change that later. But the claim here that, again, a lot of people seem to be perfectly fine with is that it doesn't matter what your government does. You have certain unalienable rights. It doesn't matter what we agree to, even if we change the Declaration of Independence. It doesn't change the fact that you have unalienable rights. I'll point the font color change there. I don't know if you can see that, but all right. Well, what if one concedes that there is no objective morality, but there is still morality, a kind of moral relativism, a subjective reality? Well, there's lots and lots of problems that follow here. Fine on time. One sort of argument is sometimes called the cultural differences argument. And it goes something like this, that different cultures have different moral codes. Therefore, there is no objective truth in morality. Right and wrong are only matters of opinion, and opinions vary from culture to culture. Okay, there's problems here. What do you see as the problems of this argument? Without looking at my slide. On YouTube here. Yeah.
Well, at one time in the U.S., the South said that it was morally good to have slaves.
Yeah.
Societies, like the Nagas in India, it was morally acceptable to kill and eat other humans.
Yeah.
So which society was right?
Yeah. And really, I think the problem that you're putting to the relativists here is to say, you're going to have to say they were right. Right? Because if there is no objective fact of the matter, and it's just a matter of what we as a society sort of decide on, and that becomes our morality, then anything goes, in principle. The Nazis did nothing wrong. The Taliban does nothing wrong. Even Osama bin Laden, even like flying airplanes into the World Trade Center becomes, you can't evaluate that and say that that's wrong, because they weren't American citizens, or you know what I mean? Like, they weren't part of our culture. Their culture said that that was right. In fact, that was theologically, that was a sort of free ticket to heaven. Yeah.
What is the objection where they say, like somebody's born into, in a certain area in the world, and they're tied to a particular religion, and that's kind of thinking, so that's what they consider, their way to God and all that. Would that fit into this kind of moral as far as?
Well, that's a kind of religious pluralism, but we could call that a religious relativism or something. Here we're sort of keying in or focusing on moral relativism, which says the morality of a particular culture. Now, there's problems already because it's sort of like, well, what's a culture? Is that the United States? Is that a culture? Because it sure looks like we have cultures within cultures that have disagreeing, moral values and things like that, at least values. You've got the Taliban within broader Islamic culture or Muslim culture or whatever, or whatever the state, it might be Iraq or whatever, Syria. So here we're sort of zeroing in on the morality of it and saying, here's the premise. Given the fact that cultures disagree about moral codes, therefore there is no fact of the matter. One problem is to say, well, then you can't criticize, Nazi Germany. You can't criticize, again, the Taliban and these other folks because their culture, seemingly, not everybody, was okay with it. Again, Hitler went along, at least a certain point, went along with the majority, it looks like. And so if this is right, then Hitler's okay. And anytime your moral system endorses Hitler, you've got some problem or other. Right? That's kind of just a good rule of thumb. But there's deeper problems with this. What are some problems with this?
There's no objective truth with a truth statement.
Okay. It could be. So people will say that. Let me think. So the only way that's definitely claimed as an objective truth. The question is whether or not that's a objective truth in morality. There's no objective truth in morality. In other words, is that a moral claim? I'm not sure it is, but I think you're on some stuff for sure. Yeah. What else? What are other some? Yeah. No one's done the valid invalid thing. After all this hard work. Yeah. It won't be on the final, just so you know. But is this valid?
I'll say no, but
No, it's not valid. Right? Because notice it could be the case that different cultures have different moral codes, and there is an objective truth. Right? They could be all wrong. They could be all wrong but one or something. Because in effect, what this is saying is that, what if people have disagreed about all kinds of things? So at a certain point, cultures disagreed, about the shape of the earth, whether or not it was flat. Does it follow from the disagreement that therefore there's no fact of the matter? No, that's crazy, right? It's just that people were wrong about that. Some people were wrong. And so from the fact that different cultures disagree about moral codes, it certainly doesn't follow that there's no objective truth of the matter. It could be the case that, it could be the case they're all wrong. It could be the case that some of them are wrong, and likely it's the case some of them are wrong and some of them are right. Right? It doesn't make it, therefore, just a matter of opinion. There are opinions. Now, the opinions disagree. So if the argument was something like, different cultures have different opinions about moral codes, that seems right. But to infer from that therefore there's nothing objective, right? That just seems invalid. It does not follow. Yeah.
can you use this in a way to, for example, when they come with the objection, like the God is a moral monster and stuff like that? Could you take this in a way that kind of, like, well, how are you?
Yeah.
Have the.
You don't have morality or objective morality. That's right. Yeah, if you're a moral relativist, then you shouldn't have any problem with any culture whatsoever, and you kind of lose the right, it seems, to even evaluate. In other words, you can't evaluate anybody that differs from you. Because in order to evaluate somebody else's moral code, There has to be an objective fact of the matter that makes it such that their view is not right. And so even when you go to look at sort of Old Testament, it's kind of an interesting way to put it or apply it, but even when you come to like Old Testament issues where somebody says God is a moral monster, well, if you're a relativist, it seems like you can't even evaluate that, because that would be to suggest that God has violated some objective moral code, which is exactly what you're denying.
Is there another? Yeah.
People add on to this argument all of this, and you cannot fault me for holding this view because that's being authentic to this culture. And they kind of then place authenticity as a cap over it like that. As long as you're authentic.
Yeah.
How can you address that?
Yeah, I think it's the same worry that, again, Hitler was very authentic. Nazi, Stalin was a very authentic communist or whatever. And again, Osama bin Laden, I don't mean to keep picking on Muslims here, but Osama bin Laden was pretty authentic to at least sort of a reading of the Quran and so on. So it's not clear to me how authenticity is supposed to be helping here, if we just mean by that, sort of consistent with the moral code of a society. Because it at least begs the question that there's not some sort of objective moral code that we can. So in other words, if you think that you can evaluate different moral codes, you're not a moral relativist. Because there has to be some objective moral code by which you, even if it's your own society's moral code. So if you say, back in the day, this is your example of slavery, if you think we've done better these days on the slavery issue or the gender issue or the Me Too movement or anything like that, if you think we're making progress means there's some sort of outside standard that we're sort of getting closer to and doing better with. That's going to be objective. It's got to be objective, it seems to me. So I say here, just because there are differences across cultures, certainly doesn't follow that there's no fact of the matter. It just could be that a lot of people are wrong. Okay, here's sort of some deeply problematic consequences of moral relativism. Again, that's the point that you can't evaluate other cultures. There's also this issue. I don't know if this is the most pressing one, but moral truths, it becomes almost too easy to sort of know moral facts. All we have to do is consult our culture, right? But again, cultures can be wrong. Cultures can be wrong, it seems. So the mere fact that we know what our culture's standards are certainly doesn't seem to be the case that we have knowledge of morality. And thirdly, there could be no moral progress. This is the point I just made. Now, this is an interesting way that people put it. It's sometimes called the reformer's dilemma. Right? We typically think of moral reformers as the sort of our moral exemplars, even. Right? We'll say, you should be like Martin Luther King Jr., because he helped reform our culture. But notice, if moral relativism is right, he actually becomes a moral villain. Why? Because he's going against the society's code. He's going against what the society says and calling the society wrong. Right? So typically we think of these guys as the sort of moral, saints or the virtuous ones. But they would end up being, on moral relativism, the only villains. All of us that go along with our societies that don't function as moral reformers, we're the ones that are doing the right thing. Whereas Martin Luther King Jr.'s of the world, are doing the exact wrong thing according to moral relativism. And again, if your moral system calls Martin Luther King Jr. Moral villain, then something's probably wrong with your moral system. That's how it kind of goes in ethics. If your view endorses Hitler, it's bad. If your view doesn't endorse somebody like Martin Luther King Jr., then. And again, there still seems to be a problem with moral grounding. I mean, we can even ask, where did these subjective morals come from, right? These relativistic values come from, and so on. Let me just see. We're kind of running out of time here. Okay. Again, it's important to emphasize that we're not saying that atheists can't, in principle, do morally praiseworthy things. We're not saying atheists can't know general moral principles. The point is that, unlike the UN Declaration, like the UN Declaration, the atheist fails to ground these moral truths, at least in a way that's satisfying and plausible. If they cannot ground these truths and one believes that morals exist, then this provides reason to believe that a morally good God exists. So it's a grounding issue. It's how do you ground morality? And the claim is that something like a moral fact, it's odd, it's otherworldly, so to speak. So you kind of need another world. You need something otherworldly to ground these facts. Right? There's no fact within this world that's going to do it justice. I mean, be a satisfying ground. And so when one thinks about the oddity, and actually there's in moral philosophy, it's sometimes called the queerness of morality. Again, that's probably a word that's not it's of an age gone by. But the queerness of it, so it's just like the oddity of it. And some people use that to say, therefore, they don't exist. Morals don't exist. Some people use that to say, look, we ought to have something that's either odd or otherworldly to ground it. And again, it's very difficult to live as if no morals exist. And I don't recommend being those folks' friends or neighbors or whatever. But if we do think they exist, we've got to explain them in some way or other, and I think that's where God makes perfect sense of them, and other positive grounds don't. Now, is there a way to pick this apart? You bet. There always will be. But what I want you to come away with this discussion is seeing that this sort of simplified, in a certain sense, this sort of claim that there is a God of a certain sort, and that's the God we're going to talk, we're going to keep sort of fleshing out things that we can know about God on the basis of these things. Because I think what we get here is not just a God that is good, but we need a God that grounds morality, that in a way is the good. And there I think we get a God, who's essentially good, which Muslims deny. Or at least some schools of thought in Islamic theology denies that Allah is essentially God. So there's just one piece, but this single sort of theory, somewhat simple theory, is going to explain, or hypothesis is going to explain a bunch of these facts that, again, I think it gives us a uniquely Christian view of God. But that's my task in the next few weeks. So, any questions or thoughts before we close? Make sense to you?